Okay, academic hero number 5 is Cicero. Cicero is one of the most useful persons someone could learn about, especially if they've got a young person, they want to develop themselves, their ability to think. You want to study Cicero. Cicero is the most interesting of all the Romans. All of Roman history kind of revolves around Cicero. He's a transitional figure between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. When you study the ancient Greeks, they sort of ennoble you. They're sort of an idea of what mankind is capable of being. Like Aristotle said, it's almost like the poetry and stories. They show you how life could be, what man can aspire to. It's different with the Romans. The Romans are more sort of brutal, kind of primitive. And actually, I don't even like most of the Romans. But it's worthwhile to study them because you learn about man's bad behavior. You learn about all the tricks of rulers, of all the methods of lying and the way things really happen in the real world. Like that old quote from Carlyle, there's always a good reason and then there's a real reason. When you study the Romans, the Roman emperors, you really see how mankind behaves and you become less of a chump. Because the things that happen in the modern world, they're just, most of the time, just copies of stuff that happened in the past, just with, the modern technology. And one can learn a tremendous amount from studying the Romans. It's one of the most important things I would say for a young person, if they want to develop any type of intellectual sophistication, is to know the Greeks and the Romans. Okay, so Cicero, he lived from 106 to 43 BC. Here's a quote from Rufus Fears, PhD, professor at the greatcourses.com courses. It's now called Wondrium as well. Rufus Fears is like the best professor out of all their history professors, and I've gone through over 100 of their courses. He's got this greatest view of history in a long scope, and he makes everything into a story, very interesting, very memorable. And here's what he has to say about Cicero. Cicero was the noblest of the Romans. Cicero is the Roman equivalent of Plato. Cicero was as fluent in Greek as he was in Latin. Okay, well that's because Cicero had been raised by Greek tutors, and he traveled to Greece to learn more about Greece, its philosophers, historians, and orators, and he translated some books from Greek into Latin, like the Timaeus, for example, which is then featured in the painting by Raphael, School of Athens. Cicero had said that an orator is a performer like an actor. He was the best orator in all of Rome that ever lived in Rome, perhaps that ever lived anywhere. He had relatively poor origins, but he rose to be the leader of all Rome due to his magnificent oratory skills. And then here I joke about what was the Roman Republic like, their celebrities, a bunch of thugs for the most part. Pompey was a thug, Crassus was a thug, I think Cato was a thug, Caesar was a brilliant thug. Cleopatra was a femme fatale. Anyways, Octavian was another brilliant thug. But what I'm trying to say is Cicero is different. Cicero is light and hope and happiness. He was multilingual, hyperliterate genius. He was good. I really like Cicero. Now, don't get me wrong. Cicero's no angel. He was a lawyer and he played all kinds of games and tricks. But it's going to be very valuable to learn those because you'll see him every day in the real world, in the modern world. And also, I think, a lot of young students are like, why do we have to learn this in school? Because a lot of stuff they learn in school is pointless. Memorize a bunch of vocabulary words and then forget them after the test. That's a waste of time. I can tell you, though, learning Cicero, what you learn about Cicero, you'll remember it the whole rest of your life. You will see it in application in every day, and understanding its context related to Cicero. All judgment is comparative. That's been said in the past, and it's true. You're always going to judge things by comparing it with what you already know. You learn things by comparing it to what you already know. And you will see the things that Cicero says every single day in your regular life, and they'll be valuable to you. So it is highly worth your time to learn about this. And young people should be studying biographies of great men like Cicero, like Aristotle, for example. Okay, so here's a quote from Cicero. Our minds have an insatiable desire to know the truth. And it's like an echo of Aristotle. Cicero, I would rather be wrong with Plato than right with a Pythagorean. And that's kind of funny in a lot of ways. Okay, Plato was the first to call philosophy down from the heavens and to focus it on the people, to inquire about our life, our standards, our goods, and our evils. So he's a big admirer of Plato. I actually admire Aristotle a lot more than Plato, but there's a lot of good things that came from Plato as well. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. Cicero, some more of his quotes. Friendship doubles our joy and halves our grief. A room without books is like a body without a soul. And then the next thing, here's Cicero on reading. And I can tell you, studying a lot of the great geniuses, they read a ton. And, that's where the information is. If you want to really develop your mind, you got to read a lot. Okay, here's Cicero. Read at every weight. Read at all hours. Read within leisure. Read as one goes in. Read as one goes out. The task of the educated mind is simply put, read to lead. Okay, and now the next sentence is what is called a periodic sentence. A periodic sentence is one where the most important word comes right at the end. And the reason for making a sentence like this is that it keeps the person in suspense until they get to the end of the sentence, and then it comes the big answer, the big punchline, and that's very memorable. So that's called a periodic sentence, and Cicero was the master of that. It's almost like professing something with great certainty. So here it comes from Cicero. Not to know what happened before you were born is to forever remain a child. So not to know what happened before you were born is to forever remain a child. And most people don't study history. So if you don't study history, you've got no way to judge current events. And basically, you're not intellectually sophisticated. And I've been kind of amazed at how most people don't read and they don't know any history, which basically means they have no intellectual sophistication or ability to judge current events with a historical view. It's a historical worldview that enables you to anticipate both good things and bad things. And so it's kind of sad, so that basically intelligent person is trapped by the ignorance of the functional illiterates who can't judge anything and who basically push things in a negative direction so often, sadly. But anyways, for what it's worth as an individual, I've also seen that people who are sophisticated and understand all these conversation and maneuvers of Cicero and his compatriots, they are more able to navigate a good path for themselves in the modern world. Okay, here's another quote of Cicero. Rhetoric is speech designed to persuade. So, in their own way, Socrates and Plato were great rhetoricians, even though they complained not to be. They said they were not sophists, and they criticized the sophists. They were so-called sophists in many ways on their own, and kind of like did what they accused others of doing. But Cicero was great with rhetoric. Rome was famous for having schools of rhetoric. Back in those days, to be a good public speaker was one of the highest things a man could aspire to. And Quintilian was another Roman who ran a great school for training public speakers, and Cicero was his big hero. Like I said, Cicero was considered by many, many people to be the greatest public speaker who ever lived. Cicero, quoting on public speaking, the orator has three functions: to teach, to please, and to move. Nothing is so unbelievable that oratory cannot make it acceptable. I've noticed that too. You can't. There's anything that's well said in a promotional way. You can get a stupid chump person to believe it. Anything. They have no ability to have a fixed frame of reference and judge. That's why they're so vulnerable to being tricked and ripped off. Okay. Next from Cicero, there is nothing so absurd as to not have found a supporter in one of the philosophers. Okay, now here's a quote by Cicero. This one's useful. Lucius Cassius, whom the Roman people considered the wisest and most conscientious of judges, was in the habit of asking repeatedly, who has profited by it? Who has profited by it? In Latin, that is, cui bono, cui bono. No man attempts to commit a crime without the hope of profit. And that's a good thing to ask yourself. Whenever you hear something going on that seems ridiculous, just ask yourself who benefits. And quite often, if the person who benefits has the power to make it happen, they're the ones that made that happen because they had the power. Okay, so that's a good way a lot of times to figure out why things happen. Okay, next from Cicero. This is another rhetorical trick. By repetition, it makes an argument seem more compelling, even if it really has no substance to it. So when he would describe something that he would want the audience to remember, he would repeat it multiple different times with slightly different phrasing. So here's a typical example. He departed, he withdrew, he strode off, he broke forth. And that, of course, can also be for comedy. You know, Monty Pythons would play on things like that. But it is also an effective rhetorical trick. Where rhetoric came from largely was the ancient Greeks had made summaries of all the effective speaking techniques. And these were then taught by the sophists to the younger students. And these then were passed on to the Romans. And Cicero was the expert on all this stuff. And these things do have an effect on people, especially if they don't know the rhetorical strategy. When you recognize a rhetorical strategy, you can point it out and say, oh, you're just using repetition. Oh, you're just using a periodic sentence, to add effect. And you can weaken the rhetorical strategy by recognizing it and labeling it. Okay, Cicero. He won tons of legal cases. He was a great lawyer. Humans are fundamentally ruled by their emotions. To sway an audience, emotions are the most important task for winning. For among all things, emotions are the single most important point in winning verdicts. Emotion is the most important thing. So that's key too, because emotions are more powerful. If you look at the human brain, we talk about the brainstem. The reptile brain in the middle is the limbic system, the emotional brain, and that having much more power in controlling the cerebral cortex, the thoughtful brain, than the opposite. The cerebral cortex has a lot more difficulty controlling the emotional brain. You can use the old analogies of the rider and the horse, etc. Okay, Cicero continues, when you have no basis for argument, abuse the plaintiff. Now that happens all the time. Whenever you see somebody's getting emotional, like more than they should with an argument, it's usually because their position is very weak. And that unfortunately ends up a lot of times being an effective rhetorical strategy. But if you point it out and it's a fair discussion setting, then that's useful. And here's Cicero again. Orators are most vehement when their cause is weak. So when the person gets all emotional and vehement, if you will, that you should be pointing out. You know that they're actually in a weak position, and you should point it out rather than back down from it. Okay, Cicero. Praise your allies and criticize your enemies. So Cicero was very big on that, and that's a very popular rhetorical strategy, to always try to associate one's allies with positive things, one's enemies with negative things. The only downside to that is if you repeatedly do something, then everybody knows that that's dishonest. But most people are too stupid to recognize that strategy, but that's a very common strategy. Again, you'll see these things every day. Okay, rhyme is a magnet for the ear. This is all Cicero quotes. Make a rhyme for the key part of your presentation. So the classic one is Johnny Cochran with the O.J. Simpson case. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. The rhyme is memorable, and that helped O.J., And so, all these years since the O.J. Simpson case, and that's what I remember. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. From Johnny Cochran. So repetition of key points gets the audience to believe it, whatever it is. The more you repeat it, the more they believe it. And that's been my experience too. You could say, somebody who's got the ability to get their word out can say the stupidest, most incorrect thing. But when it's repeated, the average dumb person believes it just because they hear it all the time. Well, everybody knows that. Yeah, right. Okay. Now, Cicero also had some problems with a man by the name of Catiline. And so Cicero was trying to win, so to speak, against Catiline. And these are some of the ways that he would speak about Catiline. What he's doing here is he's associating Catiline with negative things. And you can see how Cicero plays this game and recognize when you see it in life that a lot of times it's being used in a very unfair way. So here's Cicero on Catiline. Every gladiator with an inclination towards crime is on familiar terms with Catiline, and every second-rate actor with a predilection for vice calls him friend. In all of Italy, it is impossible to find a single gladiator, thief, cheat, glutton, spendthrift, or whore, or depraved person who will not admit that he has been on intimate terms with Catiline. So that's the Roman way of trying to smear somebody. Okay, continuing with Cicero. Cicero, into his courtroom cases, he would bring paintings that would show, his side of the case in a good light and the other side of the case in a negative light. He would bring statues in there also as props to convince the people, the jury, so to speak, of his side of the argument. And then he would have these contrasting, like, verbal argument battles to show how right he was. Ad hominem means to just insult and criticize one's opponent, repeating one's phrase, as we talked about, to drum it into the mind of the jury, the listening audience. Hyperbole, to exaggerate his point. So here's just Cicero, criticizing his opponent, and just watch how he makes it a back and forth battle. That's kind of memorable when it goes back and forth, back and forth. So I have the green, all the favorable stuff, the yellow, all the negative stuff. Simply by comparing our cause against theirs, we can see how completely worthless they are. One side is decent, the other lascivious. One is pure, the other foul. One honorable, the other deceitful. One reverent, the other accursed. One calm, the other raving. One virtuous, the other indecent. One restrained, the other salacious. Justice, moderation, courage, prudence, and all the virtues fight against injustice, extravagance, cowardice, rashness, and all the vices. He's almost wearing out the audience, so they're so fatigued. They're like, okay, Cicero, you win. So it's good to see all these games so that you can listen to them and not be persuaded by this type of rhetorical tricks. Okay, the other one is demonizing an opponent for the sake of a conflict. Okay, so there was a conflict between the Carthaginians and the Romans, and Cicero was also one of the ones sort of adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. So here he is using rhetorical questions, the questions where everybody knows the answer, but it creates an urge in the audience to answer the question in an emotional way. So here he is talking about the Carthaginians. Who are they who have so often broken treaties? The Carthaginians. Who are they who have waged war with such atrocious cruelty? The Carthaginians. Who are they who have laid waste to Italy? The Carthaginians. Who are they who pray for pardon? The Carthaginians. Yeah, I get the Carthaginians, the football team, win the game. Okay, but what I'm saying is recognize these tricks, because a lot of times people use them in a dishonest way, and if you don't recognize the rhetorical strategy, it'll seem compelling, but then once you realize what they're doing, you realize it's bogus. Okay, so now why do I like Cicero despite all these sort of nasty, sneaky things he does? Because Cicero also did a lot of good things. He sort of promoted this appreciation of Greek philosophy and history, of the benefits of education, of a lot of the good virtues of the old Roman Republic. The Roman Republic did have a lot of honorable stuff. When you read about it, you'll actually be rather impressed about their sense of patriotism, their sense of pride. They did a lot of good things. Okay, so anyways, here's Cicero talking about what he saw as an unfortunate transition in Rome, as there was a decline in respect for the old ways and the old virtues of the Roman Republic. And he sensed that Rome was descending into dictatorship, and he did not want to help Julius Caesar impose a dictatorship on the Roman people. And here's just a quote of sort of the things Cicero was saying in that context. The Republic, when we inherited, was like a beautiful painting whose colors were already fading with age. But in our time, not only have we neglected to freshen it by renewing the original colors, but we have not even bothered to preserve its forms and outlines. What now is left of the ancient customs on which the Commonwealth of Rome was firmly founded? They have been so utterly buried in oblivion that not only are they no longer practiced, but they are forgotten. Okay, so I think that's it for Cicero, and Cicero is well worth learning, and it applies to modern life quite a bit, so hope that was helpful.